It's a pleasure to be here. I want to say two things before I start. And one is that the work that I'm going to show and the report that we wrote for the Pathways piece is jointly written with Erin Faley, who is a PhD student here at Stanford and sitting right here. So I want to make sure I acknowledge that this is as much her work as mine. And secondly, I was thinking while Aaliyah was talking, so the data that I'm going to show you suffers from these problems that Aaliyah mentioned. That is, it conflates sex and gender, and it's binary. That is, it's mostly from administrative data where it's not actually even clear who identifies the sex or the gender of the person. And so it'd be interesting to see how the data I'm going to show you would change if we had more complex and interesting data, but we have what we have right now. So I want to start by talking about patterns of educational equality by sex/gender. I'm going to go back and forth between those two terms because the way the data are collected is actually unclear. Now you've made me very self-conscious about what I actually say. And you can see here that it has the word, some of these slides, have the word gender in them and have male, female in them, which is like a no-no now, I'm realizing. Anyway, sorry. So for the questions we wanted to look at was, how are males and female students doing in the educational system in terms of educational outcomes? We're going to look at two main things. One is their average test scores on math and reading tests, and one is their college completion rates. These are kind of two, admittedly crude, but sort of useful and relatively universally available measures of educational success. And so they provide a kind of high-level perspective on educational outcomes for males and females. So these are data from NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is a standardized tests in math and reading that are given to large representative samples of 4th and 8th graders and 17-year-olds across the United States periodically and have been done so for decades. So they provide us not just measures of differences in academic achievement, but also trends over time in those differences. So what we have here are 4th, 8th grade, and then 17-year-old measures of math and reading scores. And the red line shows the male-female gap in math, where a positive number means males are outperforming females in math. And the green line shows the male-female gap in reading scores. And here a negative number means females are outperforming males in reading. In other words, if the line is above the 0 point, males are outperforming females, and if the line is below the 0 point, females are outperforming males. And so what you can see here is that in math, at all grade levels, boys are slightly outperforming girls, but not by very much. So the sort of common stereotype that boys do better in math is at best only very weakly true on average in the United States. It depends a little bit on what kind of math test you give students. Some kinds of tests you see bigger differences than other tests. But on these big national tests, the average difference in math is very close to 0. These are standard deviation units, so those differences are about on the order, at age 17, when they're largest, they're about 1/3 of a grade level difference, so they're not particularly large even in high school. Though you can see the math gap does get bigger from 8th grade to high school. That is, it's pretty small or near 0 in 4th and 8th grade, but does seem to grow a bit by high school when gender stereotypes and gender norms start to become more salient, both to boys and girls. The reading gap, in contrast, favors girls at every grade level by roughly 2/3 of a grade level. So consistently at all grade levels and for the last few decades, girls have outperformed boys on standardized tests of reading by roughly 2/3 of a grade level on average. And so the story is that there's partly somewhat of a stereotyped picture, what the stereotypical picture, boys better in math, girls better in reading, but it's not nearly as pronounced as I think some common perceptions of us would have us believe. The second thing we looked at is college graduation rates, and for this we used data from Claudia Golden and Larry Katz's book. And this is the college graduation rate by sex. Apparently Claudia and Larry know how to use the word sex. By sex, so males and female college graduation rates over time. And you can see that up until cohorts of students born around 1955, males were much more likely to graduate from college than females in the United States by 5 to 8 percentage points. But those cohorts born in the 50s were the cohorts of men who went to Vietnam, and during the Vietnam War, college graduation rates for men declined, whereas they didn't for females. And so women surpassed men in college graduation rates sort of around the time of the Vietnam War and following that. And then women's college graduation rates grew much more rapidly over the last few decades than men's, so that today about 5% more women graduate from college with a bachelor's degree than men. So there's a clear advantage for women in terms of success in post-secondary education, but that belies some substantial variation in the kinds of college degrees that men and women get. So if you look at STEM fields, the science, technology, engineering, and math fields, the ratio of male to female graduates is about 2 to 1 these days. So about 1/3 of graduates in those fields nationally are women, and about 2/3 are men. So even though women are graduating from college at higher rates than men, they're still graduating at much lower rates in the science and math fields, which suggests that some of that difference we see in high school, which may reflect societally induced kind of differences in norms or expectations or sense of kind of what kind of fields one can go into, those carry through into college, into the fields that women choose in college. And so there's a lot of work to be done, I think, on so despite the fact that there's some, clear advantage for women in terms of overall success, there's clear differences in terms of the fields. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is sort of the why. To what extent are these differences due to things like norms, expectations, and stereotypes? And so one thing that Aaron and I have been doing is we've been using data on standardized test scores from every single student in the United States. So we have a database of about 300 million test scores that includes the standardized test scores of every student in the United States in grades 3 through 8 over a 7-year period. And that means we can look at the gender gap in academic performance, in math, and in reading in every single school district in the United States. So we have data on about 10,000 school districts, and we can then see to what extent is the gender gap related to characteristics of those communities. In particular, is it related to characteristics of those communities that we might think would reinforce traditional gender stereotypes? So we've looked at a few things, and I'll just show you a few pictures. So on the horizontal axis here, we showed a measure of the socioeconomic conditions in a school district. So this is a composite measure of parents' education levels, income, poverty rates, single female-headed households, and unemployment rates. And so positive number means more affluent, more highly educated communities, and negative numbers mean poorer communities. Each of those circles is one of 10,000 school districts in the United States. And then on the vertical axis, we have a measure of the achievement gap measured here in grade levels to make it sort of easily interpretable. And you can see that the math gap, which is the red dots, my labels didn't show up. The red ones are the math gap. That in about 2/3 of districts, the math gap is positive. That is, it favors males. And in about 1/3 of districts, the math gap actually favors females. But nowhere is it particularly huge. These are not grade levels, sorry. These are standard deviation units. This is not the slide I thought it was. So when it says about a 0.1 standard deviation, think of that as like 1/3 of a grade level. So even in the districts with the largest math gaps, they're not more than about 1/2 of a grade level in favor of boys. And in the ones with the smallest ones, they're about 1/3 of a grade level in favor of girls. So there's variation, but it never gets too dramatically far from zero. The other thing you can see here is that in the richer districts, the math gap tends to favor boys more. That is, the gaps are more stereotypically gendered in more affluent communities than they are in poorer communities. That's not true for the reading gaps. The reading gaps are the ones in green. So in the reading gaps, on average, those gaps are about 2/3 of a grade level. And they vary substantially among districts, but there's actually no district in the United States where boys do as well as girls do in reading. 10,000 districts, girls do better than boys, every single one of them in reading, by varying amounts. Now, the other thing we look at is whether or not the socioeconomic status of children's parents relates to the gender differences in achievement. So we take a measure of the adult men's education levels, income, and occupational status in each community, and a measure of the adult women's income, educational level, and occupational status in those communities. We take the difference between it. So if that difference is 0, it says that men and women have roughly equal incomes, equal levels of educational attainment, and equal sort of occupational status in that community. If it's positive, it says men have on average higher income, higher education levels, or higher occupational status. As you can see, in almost every community in the United States, men have higher levels of socioeconomic status than the adult women in those communities. So there's an enormous amount of variation. There are some places where socioeconomic status is roughly equal, and some where it's quite dramatically different. But what you see is that the more different that is, the more gender disparity there is in adult socioeconomic status in a community, the more the gender gaps seem to favor men. So that suggests that locally produced norms, expectations, role models, and stereotypes about gender roles, that is, places where men have higher status as adults, tend to be the places where boys do better in math and to some extent in reading, in educational outcomes. So that suggests that local norms and expectations play a role in shaping the extent to which there's a gender disparity in educational outcomes. That said, there's a lot of variation here that we can't account for. But one of the questions I think that this leaves us with is, why are the gender gaps more stereotypical in the most affluent places? Do rich, highly educated people hold more conservative or traditional gender stereotypes or gender norms or expectations for their kids than low-income folks? Or is it that they have more resources to reinforce the perhaps societally produced gender interests of their children? So imagine that you have a male and a female child, and because of societal norms, your boy gets more interested in robots and your girl gets more interested in the arts. If you have a lot of money, you may say, well, I want to help my kids do what they're interested in, so I'm going to spend money and send my son to robot camp. Is there such a thing, robot camp? And my daughter to arts camp. And therefore, the extra resources you have may actually exacerbate gender disparities, not because rich people necessarily hold more gendered stereotypes, but they have more resources to act on societal gender norms. And so it's a tricky thing to figure out exactly what causes this, and that's partly what we've been thinking about, and we'd love to hear any ideas folks have. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark. Thank you very much.